Hi everyone and welcome for another Apitherapy video. This time it will be our first video on beeswax. Yeah, beeswax is quite fascinating in apitherapy. Actually, there are different point of views on beeswax and what's the use of it in apitherapy. And my favorite one is actually not really aiming towards really using beeswax in apitherapy products, but into how to use beeswax as a beekeeper when you are actually producing apitherapy products from pollen, honey, propolis, royal jelly, and so on. Because beeswax is extremely important in a beehive. In a beehive, simply because a beehive is made out of beeswax. The whole thing is made of beeswax. While us beekeepers, humans, we actually build wooden frames, usually wooden, sometimes plastic, sometimes other materials too. But usually it's wooden beehives, so we prepare those, but the entire structure inside those wooden frames is always made of beeswax. Nowadays, they're starting to use sometimes plastic foundations, so there's some plastic, but on top of the plastic, at the end of it, there's always those beeswax cells, those hexagonal cells. They are always made of beeswax. And this is the main point here. This is really important because that is actually the core. This is the beehive itself, those beeswax cells. So this is extremely important. And we have, as apitherapists, as beekeepers that actually produce products made of beeswax, produce apitherapy products, we have to make sure that this beeswax is used properly. Why? Because beeswax is actually extremely precious. In order to produce 1 unit of beeswax, a bee needs to eat 4 to 10, sometimes it said 20 amount of honey and pollen. So this is huge. So beeswax is actually way more precious than honey and pollen. This is important to understand as a beekeeper, also as a consumer of bee products. So since that is so precious and it demands so much work from the bees to produce it, we have to look at it very, very carefully. Actually, in a beehive, the cells will actually age through time. Why? Because there will be some deposits from bees being born in the hive, because that bees, a queen bee will lay an egg at the very bottom of a cell, of an hexagonal cell. That egg will develop into a larvae and then will eventually become adult and will hatch out from those cells. So in those cells, that's where the babies are born. That's also where the bees are storing the honey. That's also where the bees are storing pollen. Not necessarily the same cells in the beehive, but it's always those cells. So when you think about it, after a while, those cells will fill up with propolis and those impurities from the bees being born in them. So after a while, beekeepers have to change those. So when they change them, that beeswax is actually still good. So beekeepers can reuse that beeswax. So the best advice would be to melt that beeswax, purify it, and then print your own beeswax foundation so you can reuse your own wax back in your beehive. This way, you're avoiding external contaminants. Because if you're a beekeeper and you are not ecologic at all, you do use some pesticides in your beehive. And some, very often, they're liposoluble, so they will actually, those pesticides will go in the beeswax, which is really, there's a lot of fat in wax. It's a fatty material, wax itself. So the pesticides will actually penetrate the beeswax and will remain in it. So in the big operations where they use pesticides in the beehive, for example, for varroa mite control, well, that pesticide concentration will increase through time because they are reusing that wax all the time. So they use it once, twice, and then after, I don't know, 50 years, concentration of pesticides in the wax increases a lot. So the contaminants are just increasing all the time, because since wax is so precious, they will reuse it all the time. They will never, get rid of beeswax. Never ever. Sometimes, well, yeah, there will be candles made of beeswax this way. But if you are using pesticides in your beehive, or if you are in an area where there's lots of pesticides and the bees are just bringing them in the beehive, or pesticides are sprayed sometimes on beehives in big operations, it's crazy. When that happens, the beeswax pesticide content will just keep increasing. So if you're actually buying beeswax foundation from the market, well, and if you don't have some analysis showing that no, there's no pesticides in that wax, chances are there's a lot of them in there. And that is just increasing year after year, basically, because it's always being reused. So think about it. And if you are, very ecological, if you care for the health of your bees, and if you want to produce apitherapy products, you want the wax of your hive to be clean, not filled with pesticides. And then you put the honey in, and then, oh yeah, there's pesticides in your honey. It doesn't pass the test, if you really analyze it well. Why? Because of that wax, contaminated wax. So it's a very important topic. And now I want to bring the focus on how bees produce beeswax, because that also shows us how precious beeswax is. The bees, when they feed, I've mentioned that quite a few times, when they gather their food, they don't destroy anything. Not only that, they actually generate life, because they will pollinate the flowers as they go and forage and gather nectar that will become honey eventually, and pollen that will become bee bread eventually when the bees will eat it. So as they gather their food, which is let's say, the first element into the creation of beeswax, because they need a lot of food to create beeswax, well, they actually generate life. And then they go back in the beehive and they eat and so on. And the ones that are actually creating beeswax and building the beehive, furthermore, they will eat that pollen and honey. So from eating it, they will actually secrete. They have glands on their abdomen. They will secrete tiny little tiny layers of wax. They'll use that wax to build the beehive with it. So when you think about it, this is most probably the most eco-friendly source of construction material, when you think about it. And that's the only construction material they get. And not only that, it's very ecological. They actually generate life as they get their construction material. Not only that, but also they have zero loss of construction material. That beeswax is entirely supple, malleable. They can work it, they can recycle it, they can move it, they can replace it all the time. They never do like a cut in a piece of wood and oh, that little piece is a waste. There's no waste of construction material, zero. No waste, zero. This is amazing. Plus, that construction material won't putrefy. So after a while, they can actually recycle this. They can use it again. And the recycle system is not costly. It's very simple. They just take it, they purify it, and that's it. They have that beeswax again ready. So this is an example of really high level ecological building material. And I'm sure that through time, us humans, we're so intelligent, through time we'll inspire ourselves, we'll get inspiration from the bees, from their way to get and generate their building material, and we'll be able to find equations where we can do just the same, very similar ways of getting our building material for our houses and all our infrastructures. So this is food for thought, actually. Can we do as good as the bees are doing? And it's a real challenge for anyone involved into eco building, and all this? Can you generate life as you actually get your building materials? Can you get a building material with zero waste? Zero. Not little waste, zero waste. Can we get there and have also a building material that smells really nice, like beeswax? Such a great smell. The perfume, the aroma of beeswax is just amazing. So that's another level of challenge right there also. And also a building material that when you touch it, you feel good. I mean, it's nice. It's so awesome. So that's another way to think about it and underline the fact that beeswax is really precious, because it's also an example that is set up in nature for us to learn from and get it, find ways to do the same. We're so intelligent. I'm sure we can get there. It's just a matter of time before we learn from the bees. So here is my sharing moment with you on this, and I hope that gives you some ideas. Of course, we'll talk later on in other videos. We'll even do practical videos on how to do, creams like skin creams and so on with beeswax, how to use it in apitherapy also, because there's a lot of applications in apitherapy, how we could use beeswax, how beeswax is used in apitherapy to help our own health situation. But I first wanted to explain what's the whole dynamic behind beeswax, because that has a huge influence on the other bee products that are the most common in terms of usage in apitherapy, like for health, like honey. Propolis is the big champion, and pollen for all the nutritional value of it, and of course royal jelly and so on. So just to give you a good idea that beeswax has a really key role in the whole thing. And yes, we can use some for bee products and apitherapy, but keep in mind that it's most precious that honey and pollen for sure. Propolis, well, would have to discuss that, maybe not. And of course, royal jelly would be more precious than wax, actually. Royal jelly would be the most precious one, the most valued one. But keep in mind that wax is really precious, and we tend not to see it as something as precious. Why? Because there's so many waxes on the market, from petroleum waxes that are not from the bees. There's so many different types of wax, also like vegetable waxes as well. So we tend not to see the real value of beeswax. We tend to compare it with other types of wax that are way less precious. Like there's a huge difference, even though if they might be fine for the use we make out of them, but in the meantime, they are far away from being as precious. We're not used to think about wax as something extremely precious, and beeswax is. That's my big point today. I hope you liked that video. If you do, please share it, and see you another time for another apitherapy video.